When a woman at Los Angeles International Airport refused to let a scruffy-looking man board the first-class line ahead of her, she thought she was standing up for travel standards. What she didn't realize was that the man she scolded, wearing a backpack, an old pair of boots, and no entourage, was none other than Hollywood legend Keanu Reeves. But what happened next wasn't a viral outburst or an angry confrontation. Instead, Keanu said 5 simple words that stunned not only the woman, but every person in the boarding area, and set into motion a chain of events no one saw coming. This is the story of an airport encounter that went viral, a lesson in humility, and the quiet power of a man who spent his life choosing compassion over fame, and how, in one moment, that choice changed more than just a flight. The sun had barely risen over Los Angeles, casting a soft golden light across the glass walls of LAX. Inside Terminal 4, passengers bustled from one end to the other, dragging suitcases, juggling coffee cups, and checking flight apps with half-focused eyes. It was just another ordinary morning at one of the busiest airports in the world. Ordinary, except for what was about to happen at Gate 47B. The first-class line was already forming for Flight 108 to New York City. Business travelers with sleek roller bags and designer coats shifted their weight impatiently, glancing at the oversized digital clock on the wall. The gate agent, a woman named Dana, stood behind the counter, microphone in hand, calling out pre-board instructions with the kind of calm repetition that only came from doing it 1,000 times. At the front of the line stood a woman in her early 40s, perfectly styled. Her blowout was flawless, her handbag screamed money, and her expression was fixed in that tight, polite smile, reserved for people who believe the world owes them good service. "Excuse me, are we boarding now, or is this still pre-board?" she asked Dana, her voice sweet but clipped. "Just pre-boarding right now," Dana replied, glancing at her list. "We'll begin first class in just a moment." The woman huffed, adjusting her sunglasses, even though they were still indoors, and looked over her shoulder at the man who had just quietly stepped into line behind her. He didn't fit. Not in this line, not in first class, at least not by her standards. He wore worn black boots and a plain gray t-shirt under a slightly wrinkled flannel. His hair was pulled back into a low ponytail, and his carry-on looked more like a beat-up hiking bag than a designer suitcase. He had no assistant, no air of importance, no visible sign that he belonged at the front of anything. When a woman at Los Angeles International Airport refused to let a scruffy-looking man board the first-class line ahead of her, she thought she was standing up for travel standards. What she didn't realize was that the man she scolded, wearing a backpack, an old pair of boots, and no entourage, was none other than Hollywood legend Keanu Reeves. But what happened next wasn't a viral outburst or an angry confrontation. Instead, Keanu said 5 simple words that stunned not only the woman, but every person in the boarding area, and set into motion a chain of events no one saw coming. This is the story of an airport encounter that went viral, a lesson in humility, and the quiet power of a man who spent his life choosing compassion over fame, and how, in one moment, that choice changed more than just a flight. The sun had barely risen over Los Angeles, casting a soft golden light across the glass walls of LAX. Inside Terminal 4, passengers bustled from one end to the other, dragging suitcases, juggling coffee cups, and checking flight apps with half-focused eyes. It was just another ordinary morning at one of the busiest airports in the world. Ordinary, except for what was about to happen at Gate 47B. The first-class line was already forming for Flight 108 to New York City. Business travelers with sleek roller bags and designer coats shifted their weight impatiently, glancing at the oversized digital clock on the wall. The gate agent, a woman named Dana, stood behind the counter, microphone in hand, calling out pre-board instructions with the kind of calm repetition that only came from doing it 1,000 times. At the front of the line stood a woman in her early 40s, perfectly styled. Her blowout was flawless, her handbag screamed money, and her expression was fixed in that tight, polite smile reserved for people who believe the world owes them good service. "Excuse me, are we boarding now or is this still pre-board?" she asked Dana, her voice sweet but clipped. "Just pre-boarding right now," Dana replied, glancing at her list. "We'll begin first class in just a moment." The woman huffed, adjusting her sunglasses, even though they were still indoors, and looked over her shoulder at the man who had just quietly stepped into line behind her. He didn't fit. Not in this line. Not in first class. The woman turned fully to face him now, lowering her sunglasses just enough to get a better look. "I think you may be in the wrong line," she said, polite but firm, with the practiced confidence of someone who had corrected others before. "This is for first-class passengers only." The man didn't react right away. He looked down for a moment, as if giving her words a chance to breathe. Then he offered a small, soft smile, genuine, almost shy, and stepped slightly aside without saying a word. Dana, still behind the counter, paused mid-click and looked up. Her eyes widened ever so slightly as she recognized the man. She opened her mouth to say something, then stopped herself. She had learned that certain people preferred not to be acknowledged, not in public, not in places like this. And that's exactly how Keanu Reeves liked it. He hadn't shaved in a few days, and his eyes were tired from back-to-back charity events and red-eye flights. He was in Los Angeles only long enough to catch this connection to New York, where he'd promised to visit a children's hospital before returning to Canada for his sister's birthday. He could have flown private, easily. But Keanu hated the isolation of it. He liked seeing people, hearing their stories, observing the quiet, everyday moments that most celebrities missed by design. Flying commercial, especially economy, kept him grounded, humble, human. But today, he'd agreed to fly first class. A friend had gifted him the ticket. For once, the friend had said, "Let someone take care of you." And now here he was, being told gently but firmly that he didn't belong. The woman, now emboldened by his silence, turned back to Dana. "I just didn't want any confusion," she said, gesturing to Keanu without looking at him. "Sometimes people try to sneak in." Dana opened her mouth to reply, but before she could, Keanu stepped forward, not angrily, not defensively, just calmly. He nodded once at Dana, then looked at the woman. "It's okay," he said quietly. "I'll wait." 5 words, spoken without ego, without sarcasm, without a hint of irritation, just kindness. But it was those 5 words, and the way he said them, that made everyone nearby stop and turn. Something in the tone, something in the humility, something in the unmistakable sense that this wasn't just a man. It was someone who had known hardship and hadn't let it harden him. And in that moment, before the plane had even begun boarding, something had already shifted in the air. No one knew it yet, but this ordinary morning at LAX was about to become a story told around the world. The silence after those 5 words was louder than any argument could have been. Dana looked from Keanu to the woman and back again, as if waiting for someone to break the tension. But Keanu just stepped to the side, pulling his backpack onto one shoulder, like a student waiting for a late bus. He seemed completely unbothered, not humiliated, not angry, just still. The woman, on the other hand, felt anything but still. She turned back to the line, her lips pressed tight, her face slightly flushed beneath her expertly applied foundation. The moment hadn't gone as she'd expected. She wasn't a mean person. At least, she didn't think of herself that way. She was just the kind of woman who appreciated order, manners, structure. And in her world, structure meant people looked a certain way in first class. carried a certain kind of bag, walked with a certain kind of confidence. The man behind her hadn't checked a single one of those boxes. And now, he'd let her words hang in the air like a flag. Gentle, but unmistakable. "I'll wait." The phrase echoed in her mind as Dana resumed her announcements, her voice a little less robotic than before. "First-class passengers may now begin boarding. Please have your boarding passes and identification ready." The woman moved forward, flashing her pass with a practiced flick of the wrist. Dana scanned it quickly and nodded. "Enjoy your flight, Ms. Larimore." The name might have meant something in certain circles: finance, real estate, elite philanthropy brunches. But here, it was just another name on a list. Ms. Larimore gave Dana a tight smile, then walked down the jetway, heels clicking on the rubber matting. She didn't look back, though she wanted to. Part of her, small, quiet, hoped the man wasn't following right behind. Another part, the one she usually ignored, kind of hoped he was. Keanu didn't move until the last person in the first-class line had passed. Then, with no fanfare at all, he stepped forward. Dana didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She just scanned his boarding pass, gave him a small, knowing smile and whispered, "Thank you." He nodded in return and headed down the jetway with that same unhurried pace, as if the whole airport could take a breath and slow down with him. Inside the aircraft, Ms. Larimore had already taken her seat in 1A. She was arranging her bag under the seat with meticulous care, positioning her cashmere throw across her lap and slipping a novel from her tote. She liked first class for the silence, the space, the way the champagne arrived before the plane even left the ground. She glanced up casually as the next passenger boarded, and when she saw him, boots, flannel, that same worn backpack, her stomach gave the faintest twist. He walked past her row without a word and took his seat in 1C. Not beside her, but close enough. She looked away quickly, but not quickly enough. He had seen her glance, and she had seen something else. Something that made her skin prickle in ways she didn't fully understand. Recognition. It took a moment for the pieces to slide into place. The man in the boots, the quiet strength, the posture that somehow spoke volumes, the whisper Dana had said at the gate, that face. No. She turned again, more deliberately this time, pretending to glance at the overhead bin. And there it was. Keanu Reeves. Her heart skipped in her chest like a guilty child caught sneaking candy. She had told Keanu Reeves he didn't belong in first class. As if reading her thoughts, Keanu looked over and gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod, acknowledging her, not accusing her. It was the kind of gesture that erased shame without condoning behavior. That said, we both know what happened. It's okay. Let's move on. But Miss Larimore couldn't move on. Not yet. She sat frozen in her seat, feeling every inch of her designer coat like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The irony cut deep. She had spent years cultivating a certain image: success, taste, elegance. And yet, in one quiet moment, she had revealed more about herself than she ever meant to. And the person who revealed it had done nothing at all. Just waited. Just was. And that somehow felt more powerful than anything she could have said. As the flight attendants prepared the cabin for takeoff, she reached for her champagne, hoping the bubbles might drown her discomfort. But the thing about class, the real kind, is that it doesn't come in crystal glasses or embossed ticket stubs. Sometimes it's in the quietest seat in the room. Sometimes it wears old boots and carries a backpack. And sometimes it says nothing at all, because it doesn't have to. The engines hummed low beneath the cabin floor as the plane taxied out onto the runway. A soft chime rang overhead, signaling passengers to fasten their seatbelts. Outside the tiny oval windows, The early Los Angeles haze softened the skyline into a watercolor blur. But inside 1C, Keanu Reeves sat motionless, one leg crossed gently over the other. His gaze settled on nothing in particular. He wore a dark gray beanie now, pulled low over his forehead, as if to disappear further into himself. His boots were scuffed at the toes, the kind of scuffing that doesn't come from fashion, only time. And his backpack, resting loosely beneath the seat in front of him, looked like it had been everywhere but still had a few places left to go. If you didn't know who he was, you wouldn't look twice. Maybe you'd think he was a writer, or a musician on his way to a low-key tour, maybe a carpenter, or someone returning from a long hike in Big Sur. The kind of man who lived in the margins of the world most people chase, and somehow looked more content there than those who lived in the spotlight. But there was something about him, something in the way he sat, the stillness, the weight. Not the weight of arrogance or self-importance or fame, but the weight of having seen things. The kind of man who carried stories in his silence. Ms. Larimore stole another glance from across the aisle. She hadn't touched her champagne in 15 minutes. He hadn't once looked at his phone. No emails, no scrolling, no checking the market or returning calls. Just sat there, as if time was his companion instead of his enemy. As if the world could wait. The woman beside him in 1D, a younger executive type judging by the tailored blazer and gleaming watch, had recognized him immediately. But after a single attempt at small talk, she seemed to understand instinctively. He wasn't looking for conversation. And yet he wasn't closed off. That was the strange thing. He didn't carry the invisible walls some celebrities wrapped around themselves like armor. No sunglasses, no noise-canceling headphones, no don't look at me energy, just presence. That quiet presence was what made people notice him without knowing why. What made a gate agent's voice falter, a doorman hesitate, a stranger look twice. It was also the reason Ms. Larimore now felt the heat of regret crawling up the back of her neck. She couldn't stop replaying the moment. How she had blocked his path. How she'd spoken like someone doing a public service, protecting the sanctity of first-class boarding. It hadn't been her worst moment, but it might have been her clearest. And he had answered her with nothing more than, "I'll wait." She wondered what kind of life you had to live to have that much patience, that much grace. She knew his movies, of course. Everyone did. She remembered Speed, The Matrix, the John Wick films. But this version of Keanu was different from the on-screen personas. Less sleek, less stylized, more worn, more real. The kind of man who'd pick up litter off the street without being asked. Who'd give up his cab for a stranger in the rain. Who'd carry his own luggage, even if someone offered. She had heard those stories before, thought maybe they were PR moves, carefully managed moments designed to make him likable. But now, seeing him like this, she wasn't so sure. Because this wasn't a performance. It wasn't a moment crafted for cameras. There were no cameras here, no audience. And yet, he was still that man. The beanie slipped slightly on his head as he leaned back in his seat. He closed his eyes. Not the sleep of exhaustion, but the kind of rest people took when they were comfortable being alone with their thoughts. Ms. Larimore looked away and tried to return to her book. She read the same paragraph 3 times and retained none of it. Because somewhere between the gate and 30,000 feet, the world had shifted. She wasn't sure how or why, only that it had. And all because of a quiet man in a beanie and boots who had said nothing, and somehow said everything. By the time the plane leveled off above the clouds, most of first class had settled into its quiet rhythm. Laptops open, recliners adjusted, champagne glasses refilled with automatic precision. A few pages of novels were flipped. A few sighs exhaled as the business of flying melted into routine. But back at Gate 47B, something entirely different was happening. Dana stood at the counter, still holding the tablet that scanned boarding passes, though the last of them had been scanned over 15 minutes ago. She stared at the screen as if it could undo a moment already cemented in her mind. Her lips were pressed together, her jaw tense. She wasn't new at this. She'd worked the LAX terminals for almost 9 years, seen celebrities, divas, athletes, actors, billionaires, and wannabes. She had her share of stories, some funny, some forgettable, a few that still made her cringe. But this one would stay with her. She hadn't meant to do anything wrong. That was the part that stung. She had followed protocol, treated every passenger the same, efficient, professional, neutral. But neutrality wasn't always enough. When the woman in the designer jacket had made her comment, Dana hadn't stepped in. She hadn't corrected her, hadn't said, "Actually, ma'am, that man is in the right line." She had let the silence fill in the blanks. Let Keanu speak for himself. 5 words, gentle as fog. And then she had simply scanned his pass and let him through, like nothing had happened. But something had happened. She had seen it in the subtle flicker across his face, too fast to name, too familiar to miss. The flicker of a man used to being misjudged, and even more used to letting it go. That was what twisted Dana's stomach the most. She had recognized him. From the moment he stepped into line. The flannel, the boots, the quiet way he carried himself, it was unmistakable, if you paid attention. And Dana always paid attention. She had seen the YouTube clips, the grainy cell phone videos of Keanu offering his subway seat, waiting in line for ice cream, sitting on a park bench sharing snacks with someone who had nothing. She had seen the headlines. Hollywood's humblest star. Keanu Reeves strikes again, with kindness. But in the moment, she had said nothing. Because part of her had assumed he wanted anonymity. Because part of her had been afraid to interrupt. Because, if she was being completely honest, part of her had frozen. And now, as the gate area emptied and the custodial staff swept popcorn from the floor, Dana remained behind her desk, replaying every second in her mind like a reel she couldn't pause. She thought of how he had nodded at her, as if to say thanks anyway, even though she hadn't said a word. She thought of how the woman in the designer jacket had strutted down the jetway, certain she was protecting some invisible standard. And she thought of the way Keanu had moved, unbothered, unhurried, but somehow carrying the weight of it all without letting it show. The thing about working at the airport, Dana often told her trainees, was that you never really knew who you were dealing with. That wasn't just about fame, it was about humanity. That older man in economy might be a retired firefighter. That teenage girl in pajamas might be headed to her first college away from home. And that quiet man in the flannel? He might be the kind of person who changes people, not with speeches, but with silence. Dana exhaled and closed the boarding tablet, finally allowing herself to move. She would never forget what had happened today, not because she had made some catastrophic error, but because she hadn't spoken when she should have. She hadn't lifted her voice in a moment that mattered. And in that still, quiet moment, she'd realized something. Silence may be polite, but it isn't always kind. From now on, she promised herself, she would be both. Back on the plane, the seatbelt sign flicked off, and Keanu leaned back in 1C, eyes closed beneath the soft brim of his beanie. He hadn't expected anything from the gate agent. He never did. But he had felt her hesitation. And he had chosen, once again, not to hold it against her. Because while some people use their names to push through doors, Keanu Reeves had spent his life opening them, for others, even when no one noticed. Even when the people behind the desk stayed quiet. Especially then. The plane cruised steadily eastward, the soft hum of the engines providing a rhythmic backdrop to the quiet hum of activity in first class. Drinks clinked gently against the edges of crystal glasses, a few laptops flickered dimly in the darkened cabin, and somewhere near the back of the section, someone was already softly snoring beneath a blanket. Keanu hadn't moved much. He didn't need to. Still in 1C, still wrapped in that simple, grounded stillness that seemed to settle the air around him. His eyes were half closed now, not asleep, but not entirely present either. Somewhere between here and there. Ms. Larimore, on the other hand, had no such stillness. She had attempted to return to her novel, twice. The words didn't hold. Neither did her usual sense of control. Her mind kept drifting back to the boarding area, to the unmistakable crumple of discomfort in her chest when she'd spoken too soon, too sharply, too confidently. She remembered the exact pitch of her voice when she'd said it. "Excuse me, sir. This line's for first class." She hadn't meant it to sound like that. At least, she told herself she hadn't. But there had been a tone, a note of warning, of correction, of "you don't belong here." And now, with each passing minute, that phrase echoed louder in her mind like a bad chord played on loop. It hadn't been the words themselves. It was the context, the delivery, the way she had stepped forward slightly, subtly shifting her shoulder to block his path, claiming space that was never threatened to begin with. She hadn't asked him a question. She had given him a reminder, as if she were the gatekeeper of some invisible hierarchy. The man hadn't flinched, hadn't argued, hadn't even corrected her. "I'll wait." That was all he said. And now she knew why it had felt like such a quiet thunderclap. Because she had spoken with assumption, and he had responded with grace. Not the performative kind, not dripping with irony or condescension. Just real, genuine grace. And that, she realized, was what made it sting. Because somewhere deep down, she hadn't just been rude. She had been wrong. She looked at him now, his profile framed in the soft overhead lighting. There was a peace to him that she couldn't fake if she tried. Not confidence, not aloofness, just peace. The kind that can only be earned after losing things and still choosing to be kind anyway. She thought about all the times she'd flown first class, how she prided herself on dressing appropriately, speaking clearly, presenting herself as a woman of means and polish. She followed the rules. She noticed who didn't. And until today, she never thought twice about the soft but certain judgments she made about the people around her. A pair of sweatpants on a first-class passenger? Probably a YouTuber. A flannel in boots? Maybe a contractor bumped up by frequent flyer miles. A backpack instead of a leather briefcase? Probably in the wrong line. But now, as she looked at Keanu Reeves, an international icon in worn-out boots and a beanie she wouldn't have looked twice at in a store, she realized that real class had nothing to do with appearance, and everything to do with presence. She wanted to say something, an apology maybe, a quiet acknowledgement, even just a shared glance that said, "I see you now. I'm sorry I didn't before." But the words stuck, because what could she possibly say that wouldn't sound like more performance? And worse, what if he didn't even remember? What if her comment, the one now stuck like a pebble in her shoe, had simply slid off his shoulders like everything else he refused to carry? She turned back to the window and tried to breathe through the tightness in her chest. Sometimes regret is loud, sometimes it's heavy. But the worst kind is quiet. The kind that sits with you in a dark cabin at 35,000 feet, whispering a question you can't answer. Why did I assume he didn't belong? And beneath it, the harder one. Why did I believe I did? She closed her eyes and leaned her head against the cool wall of the plane, silently hoping the next chapter of this flight might offer her a second chance. A moment to rewrite the line. A moment to simply say, "Welcome aboard." The cabin lights had been dimmed for the dinner service, casting a soft glow across the rows of reclined seats. Silverware clinked gently against porcelain, and the scent of roasted chicken and warm bread filled the air. Somewhere in the back of the plane, a baby cried faintly, far enough not to matter. A flight attendant moved gracefully down the aisle, checking belts and blankets, her heels muffled against the carpeted floor. Ms. Larimore barely touched her meal. She had unfolded her napkin, placed it neatly on her lap, even tried a bite or two of the salad. But her appetite had vanished somewhere over Colorado. Her wine remained untouched, beads of condensation slipping down the glass like slow tears. Her mind was a mess of rewinds and internal edits, playing the same moment on loop. The line at the gate, the glance, the tone in her voice. And now came the moment she had tried to delay, to deny. Recognition. It had started small, a flicker, a memory she couldn't quite place. Not a movie, not a red carpet photo, but something quieter. A story she'd read once, a clip someone had sent her. A man giving up his subway seat, patiently posing for photos with gas station attendants, waiting in line like everyone else at a DMV. She hadn't connected it immediately, not through the beard, not with the beanie and flannel disguising what Hollywood usually dressed in designer armor. But then, as the flight attendant reached row 1 with the dessert cart, the woman in 1D beside him, clearly holding back the urge to gush, spoke. "I just want to say," she whispered, soft enough to be respectful, but loud enough to be heard across the aisle. "Your movies meant a lot to me growing up, especially The Matrix." "Thank you." Miss Larimore had turned her head just enough to catch it, just enough to see the small smile he gave in return, eyes kind. "Thank you," Keanu said simply. "That means a lot." And there it was, like a film coming into focus, every detail sharpened. His voice, his face, even the way he sat, like someone used to people looking but never asking for anything. She blinked slowly, her breath caught in her throat. Keanu Reeves. She had told Keanu Reeves that he didn't belong in the first-class line. A flush rose to her cheek so fast it burned. It wasn't just embarrassment, it was shame. A slow, creeping realization that her assumption had not only been wrong, it had been about this man. This man who, despite his fame, had spoken only with kindness. Who had stepped back without hesitation. Who had made her feel like the important one, even as she dismissed him. And now, across the aisle, he was thanking someone for a compliment. Not deflecting it, not rolling his eyes, just accepting it with humility, the way someone does when they've learned not to expect praise, but never take it for granted. She watched him for a moment longer, quietly, cautiously, unsure whether to say something or let the silence stand. How do you apologize to someone who didn't demand one? What words could undo that moment in the boarding line? What phrase, what offering, could make it clear that you knew what you'd done, not just to him, but to yourself? She thought of her friends, of the circles she moved in, of the casual jokes they made about tourists in the airport, or people wearing sneakers in business class. She had laughed along, believed she was just observing, just noting differences. But now she realized she hadn't been observing, she had been judging. And in that judgment, she had nearly missed seeing someone extraordinary. Not because of his fame, because of his humanity. And more than anything, because of how gently he had held hers, even when she hadn't returned the favor. She lowered her eyes, unsure of what to do next. The cabin around her carried on as usual. Dessert plates, gentle whispers, the low hum of jet engines. But inside, everything had shifted. Not just the altitude, the perspective. The moment hung in the air like a fragile thread. stretched between what had just been realized and what might happen next. Ms. Larimore sat in her seat, hands folded tightly in her lap, unsure of where to look. Every part of her mind was still echoing with that quiet voice. "Thank you. That means a lot." So simple, so sincere. And now that she knew who he was, not just the name, but the stories behind it, it felt like the space between them had grown infinitely more delicate. She wasn't used to being wrong, not in public, not so obviously, and never in front of someone like him. The woman in 1D had resumed her book, smiling to herself, clearly satisfied with the brief exchange. Keanu, meanwhile, had leaned slightly back in his seat, gaze out the window now, eyes calm. But there was something about him that made you feel like he was always listening. Like silence to him wasn't a pause, it was a presence. Miss Larimore wasn't sure how long she sat like that. Minutes, maybe. Or maybe it was seconds that just stretched longer than usual. And then, something unexpected. Keanu turned slowly and looked at her, not with confrontation, not with irony, just with awareness, like he had known all along that she'd recognized him and had simply waited for her to be ready. Their eyes met. She felt a jolt of something, shame, yes, but also the sharp pang of being truly seen. "I didn't mean to cause a stir," he said quietly, his voice low enough that only she could hear, though somehow it carried farther than it should have. "I just didn't want to make anyone uncomfortable." She blinked. It took a second to realize he was talking about her, about the way he'd stepped aside in the boarding line, not because he'd been uncertain, but because he hadn't wanted her to feel uneasy. She started, but her throat caught. She cleared it. "I didn't realize who you were." He gave a small smile. "That's okay. Most people don't." She swallowed hard. "It wasn't okay," she admitted. "I made an assumption, and I'm really sorry." He didn't rush to respond. Instead, he looked at her the way people do when they're weighing your words, not just hearing them. Then he said something that would stay with her, and everyone around them, for far longer than the flight itself. "It's not about who I am," he said gently. "It's about who we choose to be when we think no one's watching." It wasn't loud. He didn't raise his voice, didn't deliver it like a line. But somehow, the sentence landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples in every direction. The woman in 1D glanced up. A flight attendant paused mid-step. Even the businessman across the aisle, who had pretended to sleep through everything, stirred slightly. Keanu's words weren't meant to sting, but they did something deeper. They settled into the bones, into the conscience. Because he hadn't said them to shame her. He said them as a reminder. And in that moment, it became painfully clear. The real power of Keanu Reeves wasn't in his name, his face, or his fame. It was in his grace, in his ability to turn even a moment of quiet discomfort into something reflective, honest, human. Ms. Larimore nodded, unable to form a reply that would measure up. But he didn't seem to need one. He turned back to the window, letting the silence return. Only now it wasn't heavy. It wasn't awkward. It was a shared space, softened by humility, reshaped by perspective. She looked down at her untouched wine, then back out the window opposite him. Somewhere below, the country stretched out beneath them. Millions of people living ordinary lives, each with their own assumptions, missteps, regrets. And somewhere up here, above it all, a man in a beanie and boots had reminded a woman that who we are in small moments often speaks louder than anything we do on the grandest stages. It wasn't about recognition. It was about remembering. And she knew with quiet certainty that she would never forget this flight. The hum of the plane faded into the background, a kind of white noise that let the mind wander without direction. Keanu kept his gaze on the clouds, though his eyes had long since stopped seeing them. Outside, the sky was painted in deep hues of lavender and blue, the last edge of daylight slipping quietly below the curve of the earth. Inside, the cabin lights were low, casting shadows over the thoughtful faces of a few who hadn't yet fallen asleep. In his seat, he sat still, not with tension but with a practiced patience that came from a life spent waiting for things to get better. He hadn't meant to say anything to her, not really. But something in her voice, when she'd said, "I'm sorry," had told him she was ready to hear something true. And when that rare window opened in another person, Keanu never wasted it. His words had surprised her, he could tell. Not because they were profound, but because they weren't what people expected from someone like him. They expected charm, maybe, or indifference. They expected the celebrity version, the polished exterior, the carefully crafted response. But that wasn't him. It had never been him. And as he sat there now, arms resting on the soft armrests, eyes still on the darkening sky, a memory came to him, uninvited, but not unwelcome. He was 6 years old, too young to fully understand what exhaustion meant, but old enough to recognize it in the slump of his mother's shoulders. The kitchen was small, barely wide enough for the two of them to move around at the same time. Yellowed linoleum peeled in the corners, and the refrigerator hummed louder than it should, as if protesting the weight of its own years. A single bare bulb dangled from the ceiling, flickering every few seconds like it was undecided about whether to burn out completely. His mother stood at the sink, washing dishes with her back to him. The sleeves of her sweatshirt were damp from where she'd splashed water on herself. Her dark hair was pulled into a loose knot, and every so often she blinked hard, willing herself not to fall asleep on her feet. She was always tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep could fix. The kind that sank deep into the bones. The weariness that came from carrying more than just the weight of the day. Keanu sat at the small wooden table, legs swinging beneath him, a crayon in one hand and a blank piece of paper in front of him. He had been trying to draw something, maybe a rocket, maybe a dog, maybe just a way to distract himself from the feeling that something wasn't right. He looked at her, really looked, the way children do when they sense things adults try to hide. And then she sighed. Not loud, not dramatic, just a soft exhale that slipped between her lips and hung in the air like smoke. But it was enough. Enough to pull something out of the boy. Enough to tighten his chest, to make the crayon pause. He didn't know it then, but that sound would echo in his memory for the rest of his life. He watched as she reached for another plate, her hands red from the hot water, her back still to him. That was when he said it. The words came out so simply. No hesitation, no drama. Just a small voice, steady and sincere. "When I grow up," he said, "I'm going to take care of you." She froze, not in alarm, but in surprise. Her hands stopped moving. The dish in her grasp tilted slightly back into the water. Then she turned around, wiping her palms on a dish towel, eyes searching his face. "What's that, baby?" He met her gaze with a seriousness that didn't belong to someone so small. "When I grow up," he repeated, firmer this time, "I'm going to make enough money that you never have to be tired again." And for just a second, she didn't speak. Her face softened, caught between a smile and something more fragile. She came over to him, knelt beside the table, and brushed a damp curl from his forehead. Her hand smelled faintly of dish soap and the onions from dinner. "That's very sweet," she said, her voice quiet. "But just be kind, okay? That's the most important thing. Be someone who makes other people feel safe." He didn't understand all of it. Not then. But he nodded anyway. And something in him locked onto that moment, like a star he could steer by. The promise took root. It would live in him through everything that followed, through cramped apartments and secondhand clothes, through lost jobs and long bus rides, through missed birthdays and meals that were more water than food. It would live in him as he grew taller, as his voice deepened, as life gave and took and gave again. And it never faded. Years later, when fame finally knocked, when studios called and paychecks with more zeros than he could count started arriving, that promise didn't become a footnote. It became the reason. He never bought a mansion the size of a hotel, never traveled with a fleet of assistants or security guards. Instead, he remembered the kitchen, the flickering bulb, the woman with the tired eyes and the worn dish towel. That was why he gave without needing credit, why he showed up to set early, stayed late, and remembered every grip and gaffer by name, why he took pay cuts so that others could keep their jobs, why he bought motorcycles for stunt teams, or wrapped his arms around someone grieving without making a show of it, why he shared his table, his time, and sometimes his silence. It was why he waited in line behind people who assumed he didn't belong there, why he stepped back to let someone else go first, not because he lacked the access, but because he remembered what it felt like to be invisible. That childhood promise had nothing to do with money. It was about presence, about gentleness, about becoming the kind of man who would have made that tired woman in the kitchen proud. Not because he was successful, but because he was kind. Because he made people feel safe. On the plane that night, as the hum of the engines filled the cabin and the lights dimmed to a soft glow, Keanu sat by the window, his gaze lost somewhere past the reflection of his own face. He wasn't thinking about scripts or premieres or the next city on the schedule. He was thinking of that boy, of the vow spoken over a blank piece of paper and a crayon, a promise made quietly but held fiercely. He exhaled, letting the memory drift through him. Not as sadness, not even nostalgia, but as something sacred. A compass still pointing north. Nearby, Ms. Larimore had closed her book. She wasn't sleeping. Her eyes were open, fixed somewhere on the seat in front of her, the weight of earlier events still sitting just behind her ribs. She didn't speak. Neither did he. But in the quiet that stretched between them, something passed. Not words, not apologies. Just the presence of someone who had long ago chosen what kind of person he wanted to be, and never let the world talk him out of it. The truth was, Keanu Reeves never stopped trying to keep that promise. Even now. Especially now. Because the boy who once watched his mother wash dishes in a flickering kitchen never forgot what mattered. And never stopped working to make the world just a little softer for the people in it. Somewhere above Ohio, the sky stretched out in a soft expanse of midnight blue, barely visible through the plane's rounded windows. In the cabin, the world had gone almost silent. The clink of silverware had stopped. Conversations, once whispered over dessert trays, had quieted into the hush of sleep. Flight attendants moved like shadows, soft-footed and unseen. Keanu sat quietly in his seat, not sleeping but fully at peace. His hands rested gently on the armrests. His head leaned slightly toward the window. There were no earbuds in, no tablet open, no movie playing, just him and the sky. The woman across the aisle watched him again, not out of curiosity anymore, but out of something else, something closer to reverence. There was something about his stillness that made noise feel disrespectful, like silence wasn't just his preference, but his offering. By now, she had pieced together more than just his identity. She'd started to understand something deeper, something that the tabloids didn't print and the magazine profiles never quite captured. The reason he was here, in this seat, on this flight, why he still flew commercial. It didn't make sense, not if you looked at it on paper. The man was worth millions, maybe more. He could charter private jets, avoid terminals altogether. He could have drivers, handlers, velvet ropes, and champagne on call. But instead, he waited in line, carried his own bag, chose a seat like everyone else. Sometimes economy, sometimes first class, depending on how last minute the flight was. He never made a fuss about upgrades. He'd once stood in the middle seat on a packed flight for 6 hours, giving his seat to a woman with a broken leg, never asking for acknowledgement. People thought it was humility, and it was. But it was also something more. Grounding. Keanu had never feared success. He just never wanted it to pull him too far off the ground. He knew what happened to people who stopped doing ordinary things. They became unreachable, untouchable, and eventually unrecognizable to themselves. So he chose not to disappear into private lounges and chauffeured exits. He walked through terminals with the rest of the world, because he remembered what it felt like to sleep on a bench and watch people walk past you like you weren't real. He remembered the numbness that came from invisibility, and he refused to ever let that become normal, even for a moment. Flying commercial wasn't a publicity stunt. He wasn't waiting for someone to recognize him so he could go viral for being relatable. He hated that word anyway. He wasn't trying to be relatable. He was trying to stay real. And the only way he knew how to do that was by never stepping too far away from the lives of the people he once stood among. He'd said once in an offhand interview, "I like seeing people's faces." Most dismissed it as an odd, vague comment, but it was exactly what he meant. He liked the experience of sharing space with others, observing them, learning from them, remembering that every person had their own story. The mother traveling alone with a toddler and a stroller, the college student clutching a backpack that held everything he owned, the elderly man flipping through a faded photo album between connecting flights. These weren't background characters to him. They were reminders that life wasn't made meaningful by fame, that kindness wasn't a quote, it was a practice, and that compassion had to be earned over and over again in small, ordinary choices. Like flying commercial, like waiting his turn, like stepping back in line, not because he didn't belong, but because he understood that belonging should never have to be proven with clothing, money, or titles. Across the aisle, Ms. Larimore realized something else. That quiet man in the flannel wasn't trying to make a point. He wasn't trying to teach anyone a lesson or shame anyone for how they'd treated him. He was just living the promise he'd made a long time ago. To be someone who makes others feel seen. To carry dignity not as a shield, but as a gift. And in a world full of VIP entrances and velvet barriers, Keanu Reeves had chosen the most radical seat of all, the one beside everyone else. The plane had begun its slow descent into New York. Outside, the sky was still dark, the lights of the city beginning to glow like scattered stars below, blurring through the morning mist. Inside the cabin, a few lights flickered back on. Seats adjusted, blankets were folded. The dreamlike stillness of the red-eye flight slowly gave way to the quiet murmur of reawakening. Some passengers stretched, blinking sleep from their eyes. Others remained curled in their seats, reluctant to leave the small, suspended world they'd inhabited for the past few hours. But near the front of the cabin, one person hadn't needed the captain's announcement to be alert. Clara, the lead flight attendant, had been watching 1C since the moment they'd boarded. She was in her early 50s now, with 26 years of flight experience stitched invisibly into the seams of her uniform. She'd served celebrities, executives, heads of state. She knew how to spot the ones who wanted attention, and the rare few who wanted none at all. From the moment he walked onto the aircraft, with nothing but a soft, "Good evening," and a grateful nod, she'd known exactly who he was. Not because of the movies, because of the stories. Flight crews talk. They share legends across layovers and hotel bars. Not the tabloid ones. There was the time a flight had been stuck on the tarmac in Chicago for over 4 hours. The crew was exhausted. Passengers were restless, wrappers and half-finished drinks piling up. Clara hadn't been on that flight, but she'd heard about it from a colleague. He had stood up, quietly asked for a trash bag, and walked the aisle himself, collecting garbage, cracking jokes, helping people pass the time without ever drawing attention to what he was doing. He hadn't needed to be asked. He'd just seen what was needed. And then there was Bakersfield. A freak storm had grounded a regional flight overnight. No hotel rooms, no shuttles, no clear plan. Most celebrities would have made a call, arranged a private car, and left everyone behind in their wake. But not him. Keanu had gathered a group of stranded passengers, strangers, and organized a van to drive them all to Los Angeles together. He didn't just pay for it, he drove it, took the wheel himself, asked people what kind of music they liked, and even narrated bits of California trivia from his phone to keep people entertained. One woman said it felt like a field trip, except her guide was an action star with no ego. And then there was the story Clara knew best. Because that one had come from her friend Melanie. A late flight to Toronto 2 years ago. One of those flights where everyone's tired, nerves are thin, and no one wants to deal with chaos. But chaos had found them anyway, in the form of a young mother traveling alone with 2 kids, one of whom was mid-meltdown before they'd even left the gate. The mother had been struggling, juggling bags, dropping snacks, fumbling headphones, trying to soothe her screaming toddler while bouncing a baby on her hip. People around her were already sighing, turning up their headphones. The usual. And then, he had appeared. Keanu Reeves, kneeling quietly in the aisle next to her seat, not looking for attention, not whipping out his phone for some viral, "look how good I am" moment. He just crouched down and started talking to the boy, calmly, warmly, showed him a small dinosaur toy he had tucked in his backpack. Melanie said he must have kept it in there for moments like this. He talked about how he used to get scared flying when he was little too. Something about thunder and dinosaurs and pretending the clouds were marshmallows. Melanie couldn't remember all the words, but she remembered what happened. The boy stopped crying. The mother started crying. And Keanu? He stayed with them until the plane took off, gently easing the child into sleep, letting the mother breathe for the first time that evening. Then he returned to his seat like nothing had happened. No big moment, no acknowledgement needed. That was who he was. Now, Clara looked at him, sitting in 1C, still in that same flannel shirt and scuffed boots, the familiar battered backpack tucked at his feet. His face was angled toward the window, lit softly by the pale glow of the cabin light. His expression unreadable but untroubled. You'd never know, looking at him, that he'd changed the trajectory of so many days for so many strangers. That he had made exhaustion easier, fear lighter, and long waits shorter. That his presence, quiet as it was, had become something people remembered. Not like a celebrity sighting, but like a kindness that had no obligation behind it. Clara blinked, her heart full in a way she couldn't quite name. She straightened her shoulders, then moved gently down the aisle with her cart, whispering offers of tea and water to the passengers who hadn't yet closed their eyes. But in her mind, the stories kept playing. And in her chest, one quiet truth settled in like a gift. The real power of a person isn't in what they demand. It's in what they choose to give, again and again, when they don't have to. And somehow, Seat 1C held someone who understood that better than anyone. She could see the woman in 1A glance over at him again. Nervous, respectful, maybe even embarrassed. Clara had caught part of their interaction at the gate before boarding. She'd seen that moment, The way he stepped back. The way the woman stood a little too tall, mistaking appearance for access. It wasn't uncommon. People liked rules. They liked lines. They liked thinking they could tell who belonged where. But Clara knew better. So did Keanu. She moved quietly down the aisle now, offering water, checking seatbelts, smiling gently at sleepy faces. When she reached 1C, he looked up, eyes kind. "Morning," he said, as if they were old friends passing on the street. "Morning," Clara replied. "Smooth flight?" He nodded once. "Very." There was a beat, a small pause that held a weight of understanding. "Thank you," she added softly, her voice low enough for only him to hear. "For always being exactly who you are." He gave her a look, half surprised, half touched. Then he offered the same simple, genuine smile that had disarmed casting directors, comforted strangers, and quieted crying children. "Thank you," he said back. "That means a lot." She moved on, not lingering. She didn't need a selfie, didn't need to tell him which stories she knew. The look they'd shared was enough. A quiet recognition between people who understood that real decency wasn't loud. It didn't ask to be seen. It just showed up. And in that moment, as the plane began its final descent into a city that never slept, Clara knew one more story to add to the quiet legend of Keanu Reeves. A story not about what he did, but about how much he never needed the world to notice him to choose kindness anyway. The wheels touched down on the JFK runway with a soft thud, followed by the familiar rush of reverse thrusters. The plane slowed steadily, its nose slightly dipping as the city lights came into view, scattered across the waking skyline like tiny embers. Inside the cabin, seatbacks began to rise, and tired eyes blinked against the overhead lights that flickered back to full brightness. Keanu remained still, as if the landing hadn't happened at all. He didn't rush to unbuckle his seatbelt or grab his bag. He simply sat, eyes calm, letting the world come back into focus at its own pace. For most passengers, this was the part where patience disappeared. Everyone became eager to reclaim control, stand, stretch, disembark. First class or not, the moment the plane stopped moving, people started pushing forward as if the next hour of their lives depended on getting 5 steps ahead. But not him. And as it turned out, that final stretch of the flight held one last moment, one that no one in the cabin would forget. The flight attendant, Clara, had just returned to the front of the cabin, prepping the door for arrival. She nodded once to the gate agent waiting on the jet bridge. The seatbelt sign went off with a soft ding, followed by a chorus of clicks as people popped up and pulled bags from overhead bins like a race had just begun. Ms. Larimore stood, a little slower than the others, and reached for her carry-on. Her designer jacket was buttoned perfectly, her hair smooth despite the long flight. She was composed, but something in her demeanor had softened, like a wall that had decided it didn't need to hold up the ceiling anymore. She glanced toward Keanu one last time, unsure whether to speak. She had said her piece earlier, apologized in hushed tones, and he had accepted it with that same still grace. But she still didn't know how to thank someone for responding to disrespect with dignity. As if sensing her hesitation, Keanu finally moved. He reached down and retrieved his backpack, not with the hurried urgency of someone ready to bolt, but with the same gentle rhythm he carried through everything. And then, instead of turning toward the exit, he turned toward the back. It was so subtle that most people didn't notice. But Clara, who had been watching from the galley, tilted her head. Keanu took 3 slow steps back into the first row of economy, where a woman was struggling with a baby in one arm and a car seat in the other. Her toddler was crying, overwhelmed by the jostling crowd and the early hour. No one had offered help yet, not because they were cruel, but because they were busy, distracted. caught up in their own re-entry into the world outside the plane. Without a word, Keanu stepped into the narrow aisle and gently lifted the car seat from the overhead bin. "Here," he said quietly. "Let me help." The woman blinked in surprise. "Oh, thank you," she stammered, trying to juggle gratitude with exhaustion. He didn't smile in the way that asks for credit. He just nodded, held the car seat steady while she adjusted her grip, then handed it to her carefully, like it was something more fragile than plastic and fabric. Then he stepped back into the first-class cabin, resumed his place in line, and waited again. Clara's eyes met his from the galley. No words were exchanged, but she offered him a quiet nod, one professional to another. A thank you spoken without speaking. When the doors opened and the passengers began filing out, Keanu didn't rush to be first. In fact, he waited until nearly everyone else had stepped past him, including the woman with the children. Only then did he begin walking toward the jet bridge, the city rising to meet him. The gesture hadn't been grand, it hadn't been loud, but it had been first class. Not the seat, not the service, but the man. Because in a world where everyone rushed to claim overhead space and early exits, where kindness was often saved for the cameras, Keanu Reeves had chosen, once again, to do something no one expected. He turned around, and in doing so, he reminded everyone within view that sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is simply help. By the time Keanu stepped through the glass doors of JFK's Terminal 4, the morning rush had already taken over. Travelers bustled from gate to baggage claim, phones pressed to ears, suitcases in tow, caffeine fueling their forward motion. Outside, the streets were slick with early rain, and the city was stretching itself awake in that uniquely New York way, noisy, impatient, alive. Keanu walked quietly beneath the terminal lights, his backpack slung over one shoulder, boots rhythmically tapping the tiled floor. No entourage, no security detail, just a man in a beanie, blending in with the world as if it had always been this way. But 24 minutes after he disappeared into the crowd, the world began to notice. It started with a tweet, just a few words, posted by a tired mother from 23B who had watched what happened with the car seat. She hadn't realized it was him until the woman beside her whispered it during deplaning. She didn't have a photo, just a blurry memory of the moment and a growing desire to thank him in whatever way she could. Keanu Reeves helped a woman with her baby after our flight. Quiet, kind, didn't make a scene. Didn't even wait to be thanked, just turned around and helped. Real first-class behavior. Shash Keanu Reeves. By the time she reached the baggage carousel, her phone had exploded. Hundreds of retweets, thousands of likes. Comments from people who had heard similar stories. People hungry for something good, something simple. Then came the flight attendant's post. Clara, who had hesitated before hitting share, but decided the world needed a little more of this. She posted a single sentence, along with a photo she had taken from the front galley just before landing. The frame was grainy, but unmistakable. Keanu Reeves, backpack slung over his shoulder, helping a woman gather her things while the rest of the cabin jostled for the exit. Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear flannel and carry their own bags. The internet caught fire. People didn't just like it, they needed it. In a timeline flooded with division, scandal, and headlines that screamed chaos, here was something that felt different. Something that whispered instead of shouted. A story without agenda or ego. Just a reminder that goodness still existed, and that sometimes it flew coach and lifted car seats. By mid-morning, the hashtags had started trending. Keanu kindness. Real life. Hero. First class. Flannel. A Reddit thread appeared within the hour. What's the nicest celebrity you've ever met? and it quickly became a shrine to Keanu Reeves. Story after story poured in. A production assistant who recalled how Keanu brought coffee to every member of a crew, individually. A bike messenger who found his stolen ride replaced with a new one and a quiet note. Ride safe. K. One user posted a photo from years ago. Keanu sitting on the floor of a New York subway, knees tucked, hands folded, just riding like any other passenger. Like someone who didn't think he was better than the people around him. And then, there was the woman from the flight, the one in the designer jacket, who posted something on her private Instagram account later that afternoon. No selfies, no filters, just a black screen with a few lines of text. Today, I learned that humility is louder than status, that kindness doesn't dress up to be noticed, and that the man I judged in line taught me more in 5 words than most people do in a lifetime. I'm sorry for the way I spoke to you. Thank you for your grace. A woman who's still learning. Her name wasn't tagged. It didn't need to be. The story had outgrown individual names by then. It wasn't about the woman or the car seat or the flight. It was about something else. About the quiet power of decency. About what happens when a person chooses presence over performance. About how one gesture, small, simple, unseen by most, can ripple outward and remind the world of who we're capable of being. Keanu never posted about it. He never commented, never retweeted, never issued a statement. He was already on a sidewalk in Queens, hoodie pulled up, walking toward a diner he liked. He'd order eggs and black coffee, tip in cash, smile at the waitress, and leave without needing anyone to know his name. Because for him, the point was never the attention. It was always the intention. The first ripples began quietly, like all real change does. Not with fireworks or headlines, but with hushed conversations over breakfast tables, forwarded messages in group chats, and the soft, hopeful sighs of strangers scrolling through their phones. Somewhere in Omaha, a high school teacher read the story aloud to her students during morning advisory. In Seattle, a coffee shop pinned a printed-out tweet on their bulletin board, circled in red ink, with the words, "Be like this." The story had taken on a life of its own. Within 48 hours, the moment between Keanu Reeves and a tired mother on a plane had spread beyond the usual corners of the internet. It jumped from social media to morning news anchors who shared it between weather updates and market reports, their voices noticeably gentler when they read the details. Radio DJs brought it up during rush-hour traffic segments. Podcasts discussed it, not because it was scandalous or sensational, but because it was the opposite: quiet, grounding, deeply human. And for once, it wasn't followed by a correction or a scandal. No one came forward with a different version. No grainy video was posted to twist it into something viral for the wrong reasons. The story remained pure. And in doing so, it gave people something they hadn't realized they were starving for. A reminder that not all heroes wear flash. Sometimes they wear boots, flannel, and humility. In Chicago, a man waiting for a delayed flight at O'Hare stood up and offered his seat to a young woman balancing a baby on her hip. He smiled and said, "Just trying to channel my inner Keanu." The people around him chuckled, but they remembered, and the woman didn't forget. In a small town in Vermont, a teenager who'd read the story on her phone helped an elderly woman load groceries into her car, then walked the cart all the way back to the store in the rain. She didn't tell anyone why. She just did it. At a gas station in Baton Rouge, a man quietly paid for the fuel of the car next to his, then left before the driver returned. He didn't know their name, didn't care. He just hoped that maybe they'd pay it forward too. Maybe they'd read the story, or maybe they hadn't, and maybe it didn't matter. Because that was the thing about what had happened on that flight. It didn't just change the people who saw it. It reminded everyone watching that decency didn't need a spotlight, that kindness didn't require applause, that maybe, just maybe, we've been measuring value all wrong. And the ripple kept growing. One of the largest corporate airlines issued a quiet memo to their staff. A reminder to lead with empathy, not assumptions. Without naming names or referencing viral posts, the memo closed with a simple line. Sometimes the most important person on the plane isn't in a suit. A week later, a well-known luxury hotel chain announced a new hospitality initiative focused on dignity before status. The CEO referenced the story in passing during an internal webinar, saying, "The world just watched someone carry their own bag and help a stranger. Maybe it's time we stop acting like luxury means forgetting how to serve." Even in schools, especially in schools, the story stuck. Teachers began using it to talk about compassion, about judging less and observing more. One student, in a crowded 6th grade classroom in Florida, raised his hand after hearing the story and said, "I think I want to be like that guy. Not famous, just kind." And that was it. That was the moment. Because that ripple wasn't about Keanu Reeves anymore. It was about us. About all the people suddenly pausing before assuming, looking before speaking, helping before hesitating. Because kindness doesn't need a press tour. It doesn't ask for a headline. It just needs a choice. And across the country, from airports to coffee shops, classrooms to corporate offices, that choice was starting to feel contagious. Not because a celebrity told us to, but because a man waited in line, lifted a car seat, and reminded us all of something simple. We belong to each other. And sometimes all it takes is turning around. A week after the flight, the story was still everywhere, floating across headlines, stitched into social media posts, whispered over dinner tables with a kind of reverence usually reserved for miracles. But while the world continued to buzz with hashtags and praise, Keanu had slipped back into the rhythm of his life like a stone quietly returning to the riverbed. No interviews, no comment. He just kept going, one step at a time, grounded the way only someone who had once had nothing could be. That Thursday morning, a light rain fell over Brooklyn. The sky was a muted silver, and the sidewalks shimmered with the reflection of passing cars. Keanu walked the familiar block just past Fulton Street, his boots tapping steady against the wet pavement. His destination was tucked between a laundromat and a church, a low-slung brick building with a faded blue sign that simply read, "St. Jerome Community Shelter." He'd been coming here for years, not for cameras, not for press, just to serve. Sometimes he helped in the kitchen, other times he sorted clothes. Often he just listened. Sat with the men and women whose stories didn't make the front page, whose names weren't followed by recognition. It wasn't charity to him. It was communion. He'd learned a long time ago that giving didn't always mean fixing. That dignity wasn't something you handed someone. It was something you affirmed. And that morning, as he stepped through the door and into the warm scent of coffee and scrambled eggs, something happened that made even him stop mid-step. Because sitting at one of the long plastic tables near the back of the dining area, hunched over a steaming bowl of oatmeal, was a face he hadn't seen in decades. Same eyes, same slouch, same quiet weight to his posture. It couldn't be. Keanu stood there for a second too long, just watching. The man didn't notice him at first. He was busy talking to another shelter guest, his voice low and raspy. But then he turned, slowly, and their eyes met. A pause, then a slow smile. "I'll be damned," the man said. Keanu's heart kicked. "Is it really you?" he asked, already knowing the answer. The man stood, a little shakier than he'd once been, but still with that same quiet strength. "Still alive," he said. "Still stubborn." Keanu crossed the room in a few long strides. and the two embraced like old friends who'd survived separate storms but shared the same sky. His name was Hank. He had no last name to offer, not because he didn't have one, but because no one had asked for it in years. He was the man from the park bench, the one with the sandwich, the quiet nod, the raspy voice who once told a younger, colder Keanu, "You're gonna be all right." And now, here he was, older, thinner, but unmistakably him. They sat together at one of the tables, a chipped blue tray between them, neither touching their food. The rain continued outside, drumming softly against the windows. But inside, the world held its breath. Keanu didn't need to explain how much that night had meant. He didn't need to say how the simple act of kindness, uncomplicated without strings, had changed the trajectory of his life. Hank didn't ask for stories. He didn't mention the flight, or the fame, or the viral posts. He just nodded when Keanu said quietly, "You helped me. More than you ever knew." And Hank shrugged, like it wasn't a big deal. Like sharing a sandwich with a stranger was the most ordinary thing in the world. "Figured you'd do something good," Hank said. "You had that look in your eye, like you'd been knocked down, but you weren't going to stay there." They talked for an hour, about nothing and everything, about the past, about the quiet, about how people are quick to forget that one small gesture can echo for years. Before Keanu left, he asked Hank what he needed. The man thought for a second, then said, "Just someone to remember my name." Keanu nodded. "I will." And he did. When he left the shelter, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, but something about the air felt different, lighter, like the city had let out a sigh. He didn't tell anyone about the reunion. No tweets, no photos, just one more story tucked into the fabric of a life built quietly, choice by choice. Because for Keanu Reeves, the moments that mattered most weren't the ones where the world watched. They were the ones where it didn't. A few weeks had passed since that rainy morning at the shelter, since the quiet reunion with Hank, since Keanu had walked through those doors and found the man who once gave him half a sandwich and a reason to keep going. The story of the flight had long since faded from the trending lists and viral loops. But Keanu never expected it to last. He knew the internet had a short memory, but people, he believed, could change forever from a single moment, if they were paying attention. And sometimes, life has a way of confirming that belief in the most unexpected places. It was a Friday afternoon at LAX, the exact terminal where the whole story had begun. Keanu had returned to Los Angeles for a meeting, one of those quiet, under-the-radar things he always did. No press, no handlers, just him, his backpack, and a black coffee he picked up from a quiet cafe tucked near Gate 42. He was early for his flight, as always. He liked airports, not the noise or the crowds, but the anonymity of it, the great in-between. Everyone heading somewhere. Everyone briefly equal, standing in the same line, breathing the same air. He moved toward his gate, scanning the monitors for boarding time, when something caught his eye. It wasn't a commotion, nothing loud or dramatic, just a moment. A small scene unfolding quietly a few yards away. A woman, young, early 20s, dragging an overstuffed suitcase. Her face flushed, clearly flustered, one shoe untied. She looked lost, uncertain about whether she was in the right place, her eyes darting between signs and announcements. Around her, the first-class line had begun to form. Clean suits, polished luggage, people scrolling phones, barely looking up. And at the front of the line stood a woman in a sleek, tailored jacket. Chestnut leather, Italian stitching, expensive without trying too hard. Keanu knew that jacket. Ms. Larimore. He recognized her from behind before she even turned. Her posture, the way she held herself. But when she did turn, What struck him wasn't what she wore, but what she was doing. She had stepped out of line. Gently, quietly, she walked toward the flustered young woman, who had now stopped near a corner post, clutching her ticket like it might vanish if she blinked. "Are you all right?" Ms. Larimore asked. Her voice was warm, not performative, present. The girl blinked. I think I'm in the wrong line. I can't find my gate. I'm sorry." Ms. Larimore didn't cut her off, didn't glance at her watch or sigh with impatience. Instead, she smiled softly. "Let's take a look together." Together. She took the girl's ticket, scanned the info, and then gently pointed down the concourse. "You're just 2 gates down, and you've got time." The girl nodded, eyes wide, grateful. "Thank you. I didn't know where to ask." "You asked just fine," Miss Larimore said. Then she reached into her tote, pulled out a granola bar, and handed it over. "You look like you skipped lunch. Happens to all of us." The girl took it, stunned into silence. Miss Larimore gave a final smile, then turned back toward the first-class line, only to find she'd given up her spot entirely. And she didn't seem to mind. Keanu watched it all from a distance, heart still. Not because it was grand, but because he remembered the way she'd looked the first time they met. When her words had been sharp, her posture rigid, her assumptions ironclad. And now here she was, in the same airport, same line, same jacket. But not the same woman. She hadn't changed her wardrobe, she'd changed her lens. And as she glanced around, her eyes swept past him, briefly. Their eyes met. She froze for a second, surprised. Then she smiled, not in recognition of him, but in confirmation of herself. A look that said, "I see you. And I think, finally, I see me too." He returned the smile with a small nod, then turned away, giving her the grace of no spotlight. She didn't need one. She was already shining, because in that one quiet act of kindness, she'd completed the circle. From a gate agent's mistake to a lesson in humility. From a misjudged man in flannel to a woman who now carried dignity not in her status, but in her choices. The same line, a different story. And somewhere deep inside, Keanu Reeves walked on with the certainty that his quiet way of living was never about being known. It was about reminding people what kindness can do when it's passed forward, without cameras, without credit, without expectation. Just intention. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to change the world. One gate, one gesture, one human at a time. The afternoon sun dipped low over Los Angeles, casting long shadows across the tarmac as the final boarding call echoed through the terminal. Gate 12, Flight 447 to Tokyo, last chance to board. Most travelers barely heard it, just another voice over the loudspeaker, another announcement in a sea of them. But for those still near the gate, the energy shifted. Passengers stood, gathered their things, and moved forward in a quiet rhythm, each person stepping into the next part of their story. Keanu Reeves stood near the back of the line, boarding pass in hand, backpack slung casually over one shoulder. He wasn't in a rush. He never was. Even now, surrounded by people who recognized him from across terminals and articles, and moments passed down like folklore. He moved the same way he always had, steady, unrushed, unseen, unless you were really looking. The flight would be a long one, 10 hours across the Pacific. But Keanu liked long flights, not because of the amenities or the legroom, but because they reminded him of what life really was. A journey, an in-between, a shared space suspended in time, where strangers sit side by side and sometimes become something else. As he waited his turn to board, A flight attendant glanced up from the podium. Her eyes widened just slightly when she recognized him. But to her credit, she didn't gasp or fumble or ask for a photo. She just offered a warm smile and a soft, "Welcome aboard, Mr. Reeves." He nodded once. "Thank you," and meant it. As he stepped through the gate and onto the jet bridge, somewhere behind him, a young man in a wrinkled hoodie was struggling with an oversized guitar case, knocking it accidentally into the sides of the narrow walkway. A businessman scowled. A woman sighed. But before any complaint could take shape, Keanu turned back. "Need a hand?" The boy looked up, startled. "Oh, no, it's okay. I've got it." "You sure?" Keanu asked, already adjusting his grip to help. The boy finally smiled, sheepish. "Actually, yeah, that'd be really great. Thanks." The moment passed in under 10 seconds, but someone noticed. Someone always does now. And by the time the plane's wheels lifted off the runway, the story had already begun its next ripple. Not just because Keanu helped a stranger, but because of what that help had come to mean. The story of that first-class flight weeks ago had never really died. It just morphed, evolved, into something bigger than a moment. It became a movement. First quietly, a ripple of kindnesses, a thread of stories, people helping each other in airports, on buses, in coffee shops. Then louder, schools dedicating Keanu Kindness Days, airlines retraining staff on how to treat every passenger like a person first, businesses adding human-first pledges to their employee handbooks, inspired not by policy, but by posture, humility, patience, and presence. And somewhere along the way, that phrase, the final boarding call heard around the world, started popping up. Not in the way you'd expect. It wasn't about urgency. It wasn't even about planes. It was about awakening. Because when the original story hit the internet, when people saw a man who could have boarded first choose to step back, it struck something. A nerve. A longing. To be that kind of human. And now, the final boarding call had become a metaphor. For awareness. For growth. For that last chance to look up, to notice, to make a different choice. To be better. On the Tokyo-bound flight, Keanu settled into his seat, by the window as always. He pulled out a dog-eared book, slid his boots off, and let the hum of the engine lull him into that in-between state he liked so much. No headlines here, no expectations. Just a sky full of possibility and strangers dreaming in unison. He didn't need to know, that back in LA, a little girl had just watched a man give up his place in line for her mother, echoing the same simple gesture she'd seen on the news. That across the ocean, a teacher in Tokyo was preparing a lesson about humility, with a photo of Keanu Reeves standing alone at the back of a boarding queue. That people everywhere were still listening, still learning. Because somehow, through one moment of quiet grace at an airport gate, a final boarding call had become a beginning. Not for a flight, for all of us, to take our seat in something better. The plane soared high above the Pacific now, the sky outside stretching into an endless wash of blue and silver. Below, the world turned quietly, unaware of how many stories had shifted, how many hearts had softened, because of one quiet man with a flannel shirt and a soft-spoken sense of decency. Keanu didn't know what impact his simple choices would have. He didn't calculate kindness like currency. He didn't move through the world trying to impress it. He just showed up. He waited his turn. He helped where he could. And somehow, in doing so, he reminded millions of something they didn't realize they'd forgotten. That respect isn't reserved for the rich. That dignity doesn't come with a seat assignment. And that sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is nothing flashy at all. The woman in the leather jacket learned it. The flight attendant remembered it. The woman with the car seat felt it. The world watched it. And slowly, one interaction at a time, those lessons spread. Because you don't have to be famous to be kind. You don't need a movie deal to change someone's day. You just have to notice the people around you and choose to see them. That's what Keanu Reeves did. Not just once, not just on a plane, but over and over. When no one was looking and when everyone was. The same man, the same heart. And maybe that's the real story. Not the viral moment. Not the headlines. But the quiet revolution of respect. The ripple that starts when one person steps back, lifts a bag, makes eye contact, and says with their actions, "You matter too." So the next time you find yourself in line, or sitting next to a stranger, or faced with the chance to be kind instead of first, remember him. Remember that you don't need permission to be a better version of yourself. You just need a moment and a choice. And maybe, just maybe, that's how we all get somewhere worth going. Thanks for watching. If this story reminded you that kindness is still alive and well in the world, go ahead and tap that like button so we can keep these good stories moving. Share it with someone who might need a lift today. And don't forget to subscribe for more true stories that'll make you believe in humanity again. And hey, if you've ever had a stranger's kindness change your day, tell us in the comments below. You never know who's reading or how far your ripple might reach.